Welcome back to the Marc Clair Show. My guest today wears many hats. He is the founder of the Canadian Patriot Review and the Rising Tide Foundation, the author of the Untold History of Canada series, and he is the producer of a new documentary series entitled The Hidden Hand Behind UFOs. I'm very pleased to welcome Matthew Ehret. Matt, welcome to my show.
Hey, glad to be with you.
Well, Matt, today we're going to kind of dive into what on the surface may seem like two somewhat different topics, because I originally wanted to bring you on to discuss Darwinian evolution, something that when I brought up on a live stream as having some skepticism of, I've never received so many, not vitriolic, but so many kind of, I love your show, but type comments, but you're nuts about saying that thing. So I want to talk about that, but the seemingly other topic about UFOs that you've done this documentary on, when you kind of zoom out, as we'll discuss, there is somewhat of a common thread there. So before we dive into all that, I just want to get to know you a little bit better. So take me from wherever it makes the most sense. How did you first take interest in politics, history, and everything that you look into?
Well, it's a great broad starting point. I myself had no real political identity to speak of or intellectual identity until I was a bit of a late bloomer, I guess. Wasn't that much of a book reader for fun type personality type. You know, I did like graphic novels when I was a teenager and maybe a few comic books of other sorts, but otherwise, I think I really had to be slapped down with a lot of painful truths before I started taking my mind more seriously. And that was in regards to a documentary on 9/11 that I was assigned to work on, you know, in university, or it was part of an assignment that I selected for myself and a group of other students, and doing a little bit of research. You know, it didn't take long to come across certain arguments that made a pretty persuasive case that everything we were told about the official narrative was a giant fraud. And so obviously the curious mind begins to explore the bigger questions of, well, if something like that could be carried out by something, what is that thing and how did it take control of what I thought of as a democratic government that looked out for me? I mean, I was that naive. So, you know, there weren't too many steps between that moment, which comes with a certain amount of personal crisis. I think everyone who's been through a similar set of experiences will feel a sort of trauma and it's a question of how do you process that and deal with that. So I chose to...
Do you mean the trauma of just getting over the fact, kind of accepting the fact that there is some certain kind of hidden evil in the world that operates in ways that we just are not brought up to believe, typically?
Yeah, you'd think that sort of thing is for Hollywood films to entertain you with supervillains behind the scenes running James Bond scenarios, and you know, to realize that no, there is this much darker factor to our collective history that is not treated in our textbooks. I mean, a lot of this the appreciation of oligarchism is made very obscured by design so that we don't understand how our history has been shaped, because all of history has been shaped by conspiracies, for the good or for the bad. You know, it's not that all conspiracies are intrinsically out to enslave and kill us. The worst ones are, but
it just works out that way.
Oftentimes that's so, but inversely too. Like if you think about, well, what went into the creation of a lot of the best upshifts of human civilization's emancipation from feudalism and from enslavement into higher states of accessing literacy and knowledge and higher quality of life. Did that happen because an elite self-professed masterclass just gave us liberties just because they were bored with us being like servile slaves? No, if you actually investigate it, these moments happen through a fight. There's always a fight to do that. And so things like the Golden Renaissance that saw a huge explosion of human life on the earth, and in terms of not just quantity but also quality, that accompanied revolutions in medical discoveries, astronomy, architectural, beautiful artistic and musical innovations came out of that process. All of it was tied together. It wasn't just because there was like all of a sudden a collective demand on the market from people who were like just in the dark age, living it like, you know, till 32 years of age on average, high infant mortality, and they're just like, oh, we kind of now have a demand for beauty and longevity. It's like, no, that happened because there were certain people who took leadership responsibilities and organized in a conspiratorial way with like-minded people who had a different sense that wasn't based upon an oligarchist worldview that put into motion processes that allowed for goodness to emerge, which then had to be subverted and undermined and corrupted from within and from without. And so there's always this fight between different paradigms throughout all of history, about the nature of mankind, the nature of the universe, natural law, what is the essence of these things, and so I guess for myself, waking up, at first I was very depressed after doing a lot of research over a couple of years and getting a better sense of, like, a higher definition sense of how screwed we are, and mapping out different Masonic, factors in history and bankers' dictatorships and So I was getting pretty good at that. But ultimately, I was finding myself depressed because when I would try to communicate what my research to others, my friend circle or others, if I was getting one of two effects. Either people would think I was crazy as sin, and that was alienating, or if I was successful, and I was getting better at being successful at persuading people that there was something else going on, I was just like lowering their energy. Like I was just, I didn't have any sense of hope. So I was just like, okay, at a certain point, maybe it's just better to be an ignorant slave who's happy. Maybe that's really it. And so I shut up for a while, and I just vowed, like, a vow of political silence for a sustained period. And I made a point to myself that unless I could come across something that could persuade me that there is some hope, I will not talk about this, because it's useless to me and to others. And so for me, I on a smoke break, I don't smoke anymore, but I was smoking a lot. I encountered a table, a political table with LaRouche members from the Lyndon LaRouche Association, and there was a small outlet in Canada, maybe 12 people or so. And I was bored, and they had some provocative signage. People, I don't know, have you ever seen a LaRouche?
I have run into a few in my day.
Okay, yeah. And I'd encountered them over the years a couple of times and had little conversations. Didn't go well. And then this particular time, though, I was in a different place, and I was ready to receive conversation that I wasn't prior to. And so some of the signage regarding stop the depopulation agenda spoke to me, or stop World War II or World War III. And it spoke to me. I was like, okay, I can have a conversation about this. And we did. And I wasn't overly impressed with the conversation, but I was impressed with the fact that that there were people who were doing something that I wasn't doing. Like, they were acknowledging certain disturbing facts of life that I also knew existed. Depopulation agenda, conspiratorial,
they weren't just locked in their room stressing over it. They were trying to achieve some sort of solution.
Yeah, exactly. And they'd been around for a long time. And so I thought of myself as an informed person. And I never heard of this Lyndon LaRouche old guy. He's passed away now, but I was fascinated that this has been around since the late 60s. And has been pushing for policies that were viable internationally. And I was like, okay, you're proactive, you're doing something. So I began to investigate that, and after a few months of inquiry, I was like, okay, I can volunteer. I can put myself behind this. So I did that for about 10 years as a volunteer, increasingly full time, and I think that was a big part of my growth. My growth dynamic benefited, I think, a lot by taking myself out of my comfort zone, my comfortable, or not, at least my not comfortable, but my reliable cycles of being in the job market. Being with all of my, being stuck in the machinery, it's a sort of comfort blanket in a sense. And by pulling myself out of that and throwing myself into a place where I was a full-time volunteer in a very, doing something very unconventional, like political organizing, which involved a lot of, the attractive thing for me was that there was a high focus on study, on reading original material of great minds who made discoveries. That was something that LaRouche, I really give him thumbs up on putting this emphasis on research, especially for the younger members. He was like, spend all of, he had this curriculum set up where the idea was to read the writings of people like Johannes Kepler or Leibniz, or people who made giant discoveries into the universe and wrote their thoughts down and then did things in the time that they lived. Don't read about them from experts who say that they know what they were. Don't do that. Just read their writings And sure enough, the more you do that, you start replicating their mental process of how the laws of planetary motion were discovered in Kepler's mind, or how the infinitesimal calculus, Leibniz tells you what physical experiments you can conduct to reproduce the discovery in your own mind. He wants that to happen. And so does Max Planck. So you can, in an imperfect way, replicate the method instead of just memorizing formula, and know the spirit of how these great discoveries happen. And you start noticing that they're all tapping into the same well. And that, I think, gave me a political edge when I began to carry out more of my original investigations in around 2012. Because I was in Canada as a Canadian activist with a U.S. organization. It's a U.S.-run organization, but I'm in Canada. So we're using, with maybe, again, 10 or 12 other members, it wasn't a very big thing. But we're going into parliaments, we're organizing citizens, we're going into embassies, giving briefings, carrying out, trying to persuade people that certain gigantic policies need to happen. And the problem was we weren't coming at it. It was kind of like a copy paste. You're in Canada, but you're using a narrative that is customized for a U.S. environment, and so we're telling Canadians that they have to impeach Dick Cheney, and it's detaching after a while. And I'm like, well, why are we customizing this for our own environment and mapping out the terrain here? And so that feeling of frustration was shared by a few other younger members, and we assigned ourselves the mission of trying to map out what is this Canadian history? Why are we a monarchy? What is the Privy Council? What is we're telling people the British Empire still runs the world. That's part of the line, and it's true.
That's part of the LaRouchian.
Part of the LaRouchian analysis is that the British Empire never disappeared. It continued. It was rebranded, but continued after World War II. And part of the U.S. problem is the fact that the fifth columnists inside of the U.S. that were there since the 1776 period never disappeared. They were always loyal to the British East India Company, City of London, Hellfire Club, old family systems of Europe, and the black nobility. That's part of the thing. But it's like, at the same time, I was persuaded that that's true, and I still am. But nobody did the work to map out, well, what the hell does that mean for Canada? We're still a British monarchy. How does that shape our understanding of our own story? And so what are all of these unelected operations act like? The lieutenant governors, the governor general, who is the official head of our government. What is the power of the Privy Council office? None of these things are discussed. Most Canadians don't even know about these things. And so we're like, well, let's get the history down. And so beginning in 2012, I began publishing some of that research we were pulling together. And it was really exciting because, we were just digging up. Now, I found it useful that the scientific work we had been doing for a few years on the work on Kepler's discoveries, Leibniz's discoveries, which was a lot of work on Plato, the Platonic dialogues that were part of the curriculum that I joined in 2006. So I had found that it came in very handy at breaking, or at least investigating, fallacious models of our history, because there's a lot of acceptable narratives, models that are given to Canadians, and everybody has about their own history. So where are the fallacies when pressed onto reality? And so that became very useful at reconstructing something that was more truthful, based upon the acknowledgement that there have been these hereditary oligarchical systems that have used certain techniques of controlling population perceptions. And a lot of these wonderful stories began to emerge. So I was originally provoked by the question of, well, how did progress happen in Canada if this thing always wants to keep us in a feudal state of underdevelopment and population control? How did these bursts of progress happen? And so by looking at some of these things, I started pulling together certain heroic figures that I knew nothing about in Canada, who fought against this beast in the 19th century. People who were working with Abraham Lincoln, that I knew nothing about them. But when you start digging into this, you're like, wow, there's a whole pro-Lincoln faction with political power fighting in Canada to make Canada an independent country based on technological progress, development, national banking, all this stuff that were purged. They were undermined. And then there's similar stories over the years during the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, incredible things in the provinces. So anyway, that became a series of books that I began publishing with the Canadian Patriot Review. It made a lot of conflict happen too with a lot of the members of the LaRouche organization were very old, kind of set in their ways, didn't really like the idea that, you're challenging comfortable narratives that people got used to. So there was a sort of dissonance that began to set in because myself and some of the younger people are
weird coming from them because that's sort of, the LaRouchian narrative is itself challenging certain narratives.
Yeah, well, I think it's part of the human condition. There's beautiful, good, ideas have can be really wonderful, but ideas also require personalities in the temporal world to give them momentum, right? And these personalities are never perfect. And sometimes, it's human psychology. We tend to fall into traps of getting too comfortable with our perceptions, with our desire of what things should be. And we get a little bit too rigid in our neural pathways. So it's not to undermine. It's like the American Constitution, right? It's a beautiful Constitution. It's a beautiful set of ideas of the Declaration of Independence. But more often than not, it hasn't lived up to those very high ideals throughout the 250 years that it's been around. It doesn't mean the ideals are wrong. It's just, human beings being human. We we can lie to ourselves and self-deceive and all sorts of things.
Right.
So that was my thing. And at a certain point, the personalities I had to deal with were a little bit too, I found, stifling. So we had to part ways. But I still found great use, and I'm thankful for that experience. And, as an independent analyst and journalist, I've been working with my wife to try to create dynamics that could give people more of an opportunity to make discoveries and put this into work in their own lives.
Today's episode of the Marc Clair Show is sponsored by, right here, Fox & Sons, foxandsons.com, my favorite coffee brand. And I don't just say that because they're sponsors of the show. I say that because I get a 1 pound bag shipped to my house. The proof is right here. Every single month, I get my pound of Fox & Sons delivered right to my house. You should too. Of course, I don't expect you to just dive right in with no idea what you're getting into. I want you to go get yourself a sample bag. Go over to foxandsons.com, foxnsons.com. You can check out the Den Blend Dark, as is my preference, the Tanzanian Peaberry, Brazilian Honey Premp, a bunch of other flavors still to come. Steven's always mixing it up with new, fresh beans. The best part about this business, Steven started it to not only relive his love for sharing coffee with his father, but to teach his own sons about entrepreneurship. If that doesn't give you the warm and fuzzies, I don't know what will. Just kidding. Yes, I do. This coffee will. So head over to foxandsons.com, foxnsons.com. Use discount code MCS to get yourself 18% off your order. You're going to be coming back for more. Trust me. foxandsons.com, discount code MCS. Back to the show. Well, on the subject of people being vested and wedded to certain narratives, that just makes me think of just mentioning my criticism of Darwinian evolution and all these comments I suddenly got, because it just goes against what's an assumed narrative for so many people. So when did you first start sort of running up against that narrative and digging into its actual origins, which are not really all that old?
I guess there's two phases of this. I guess the first one, before I met the LaRouche organization, but after I'd started, exploring, as I mentioned to you, my 9/11 discoveries were a big entry point from my breaking down of a lot of my comfort zone narratives in 2004. So there's a 2-year period of just exploration. With no sense of solution. But part of that involved me going down a lot of rabbit holes. Some of them took me down the alien thing, where I was like, okay, at a certain point, you're not believing anything. So I'm now just really open. I'm reading David Icke. I'm reading all sorts of things that is making me convinced that I'm a really original thinker, because I've all of a sudden, I'm getting high and coming up with great ideas that human beings emerged as test tube.
I just watched a 7-hour David Icke video and I am enlightened.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you think that this stuff is all coming from you, but you're like, no, in hindsight, I know that it was, I'm reading the books, I'm watching the videos. My subconscious is being, I'm reading Zecharia Sitchin. So I know that my subconscious is being influenced. And so, this wasn't really just from me, obviously. And so it wasn't the most original set of insights, but I was committed to the idea that, okay, Darwin can't explain certain things about the Darwinian method of analysis doesn't allow for the explanation of the non-appearance, like the fact that we don't seem to find gradualism in fossil records. We tend to find these discontinuous leaps in fossils, both human but also other things. We also seem to find in the empirical evidence that whole systems of biosystems go through changes in a discontinuous fashion, all as systems more than just individual entities within a system changing. So there's these things like whole systems are changing as systems. There's no gradualism that we seem to be finding. There does seem to be a sort of directedness in evolution. It doesn't seem to be too random that we went from like single-celled amoeba to presently speaking over like technology using light speed and language. Mm-hmm. So there does seem to be things that the popular Darwinian mechanisms don't explain away very well. So for me, I was like, well, thus aliens, duh, of course. Right. But then, of course, I didn't want to deal with the next paradox that did emerge that I was trying to avoid, which was, well, then what created the aliens? Under what, they would be pretty cognitive, and what process of evolution created that? Was it another older alien species that created them? And if so, what created that alien species?
Then you're just going back to finally find the final alien at some point. And I guess that's just God then.
And then that's God, right at the end. Right.
So here we are.
Yeah. So that was my first, at least, critical. It was useful in the sense that at least it got me critical about some of the popular narratives of Darwinism, but it still didn't quite solve all the problems. But I think that it was, again, going back to my studies, the work I did researching science and science history with LaRouche was useful because LaRouche was coming at things from a physical economy standpoint, and he wrote a book called So You Wish to Learn All About Economics, and it's a really useful book written in 1984. And the first couple of chapters goes through the science of physical economy, which he didn't invent. He's like, look, I didn't invent this. It's that there's already been this fight for centuries around looking for the laws shaping human civilization and what are the principles animating those laws. And he pointed back to Leibniz, and sure enough, you could read the reference papers by Leibniz from the 17th century and the earlier Cameralist school that emerged out of the Renaissance of thinkers that were trying to find, okay, well, if you think about it, like any system, a planetary system has its laws that govern its cycles, right? It happens to be gravitational, but then the biosphere has carbon cycles, all sorts of cycles that are organized by certain discoverable laws that maintain certain dynamic equilibrium, but also change because they're not just always the same. There's also an evolution of biospheric systems in time to greater complexity, greater division of labor. So with human systems, it's a little bit more complicated because we have free will and creative spontaneity, which is it's not expressed in the same way as animals, that are happy. Bees are happy being bees. They don't think about the hexagon in school, that learn the geometry of the hexagon. They just do it, and they build hexagonal structures in their honeycombs, and that's great.
And they've never studied geometry or any of this stuff.
No, they just do it, and like water molecules just form that way when they get cold, and they become these beautiful little hexagonal snowflakes, and that's great. But they couldn't choose to be, today I want to wake up and become an octagon or a pentagon. Human beings can choose to do other than our nature, based on will, based on folly, on wisdom. So there's all these dynamics that are additional with the human species, but we still have the need for water, clothing to keep us warm. I live in Canada. We'd be dead if I didn't have some form of heating system, clothing system, right? So you got these like physical systems. There's 8 billion of us right now. Like these laws of production, transformation of raw materials, the transportation of those materials to consumer centers, the need to overcome the limits that are caused by every moment when we always have relationships with raw materials based on our knowledge, which is always going to be limited, and whatever technological level we're at. So there's always going to be limits caused by what we don't know, right? Our ignorance of undiscovered things will cause necessary constraints of what we could potentially do or how many people we could potentially support. But if we are encouraging of new discoveries and a sort of creative flexibility, and we're not so rigid in our systems and our desire to control or monopolize things, then we're able to overcome those limits to growth by leaping over them and introducing new discoveries like electricity or whatever's coming online, right? But that requires a lot of confidence in the unknown, and also the confidence in the people and the masses to be able to generate from within themselves good judgment, creative brilliance. So, like why don't we have more, Einsteinian, or, like why aren't there more Mozarts and Max Plancks coming out of Uganda or Niger?
Stop yourself at Einstein there for a minute. That might be its own little side narrative.
Yeah,
depending on who you talk to.
I have a warm spot for Einstein, but also I think there's better examples. He had some blind spots, but all that to say, yeah, like we could have a lot more brilliant minds, but the problem is the system of empire creates conditions whereby people don't access their potentials, and they're living either in a state of exploitation, in constant war, or in the case of like us, decadence, where we're too busy just feeding our ever-growing needs to be consumers, as we were told that's what it is to be a good citizen in the 70s, is to just go to the mall and be a good engine of the consumer society. And we forgot that, no, to be a consumer society, it needs to be justified by being a productive society first. So you have to produce to justify your consumption. You can't just be a consumer. And we drank the Kool-Aid. So all that to say, that's where I think my sensitivity to the Darwinian, say I didn't forget the question. So the Darwinian flaw was given more meat was put on the bones by appreciating the fight over physical economic systems over the centuries, of which LaRouche was just simply a contemporary. He advanced it, but he wasn't the creator of the science of physical economy. And looking at the political conspiratorial agencies, especially in the 19th century, that were created to destroy the political emergence of sovereign nation states working and cooperating together, adopting the system that Lincoln had brought online during his short time in office. What I came to discover was actually known very well in the 19th century. It's almost been written out of our science and economic textbooks, is the American system of political economy. And that's what Lincoln brought online with the greenback system, the national banking structure that he brought in, the protective tariff, the idea that value is not just the consequence of desires to satisfy pleasure, as is presumed by the British school of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo and Malthus. It's not that at all. The idea was very clear, and you could read the writings of any of the advocates of this system coming from America or their collaborators in Germany and Russia and in Asia at the time in the 19th century. It's from the power of increasing the productive potentials that the idea of value is infused. And so we have money. Private enterprise is wonderfully cherished, but it's not because people want things that the money has the value. It's because the system as a whole is increasing its powers of productivity, which is something that's much deeper than it might appear as I just speak it. And this was, again, spreading internationally in the wake of the Civil War. And because I'm looking at this stuff now from from a conspiratorial angle, I'm appreciating that you have the British East India Company, the City of London. I'm appreciating the mapping of the oligarchic agencies within America working to break America up and undo the revolution as an example at that time. So I'm appreciating this. I'm also appreciating now the Canadian angle to the whole story that I didn't know about prior to this whole investigation began. And I'm also noticing that there's a lot of scientists who are working internationally to explain the new appearance or the new discoveries in the fossil records that imply that the world wasn't created 6,000 years ago. And it wasn't just Darwin versus the church absolutists, as we've been told it was. There was this whole other network of real scientists like Georges Cuvier and Lamarck and James Dwight Dana and Benjamin Silliman from America, these American naturalists who are all addressing evolution, but doing it in a way that allowed for creative leaps, design, a harmony of parts of the individual species that you're investigating, as well as the system of multiple species at the same time, a harmony of different things. So harmony, directionality, design, purposefulness were all part of a scientific analysis of non-Darwinian approaches to evolution that were all washed out, as people were told by Thomas Huxley, a major political controller and handler of Darwin, his bulldog, who was running this new think tank in Britain out of the Royal Society called the X Club, that no, you have to pick a side. You could either be a church absolutist who believes in the creationist story is 6,000 years, or you could be a scientifically respectable Darwinian, but there's nothing else, no more nuance. Both sides ultimately were fraudulent, but you wouldn't know that in hindsight, because we're not told about all these other scientists and their much more I think, healthy methods of analysis.
Well,
so
that's
was
exactly how it is
thing.
framed today. I mean, if you criticize evolution, as I saw in any way, everyone jumps to, oh, you believe in the 6,000 year, and maybe I do, I don't know, but I don't really know. But my criticism has nothing to do with any certain belief that I hold or anything that I want to, any certain God I want to believe in. But I think it's so tied into that same dialectic that has been around since Darwinianism emerged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's it's a complete. It's important for people to realize how we've often been played by these false binaries. There are binaries. I believe that there are opposites in reality. There's good and evil, and that's something. There's light and shade. But there's false binaries as well, and the oligarchy. And when I say the oligarchy, I mean people might have their own idea of what that means. I'm specifically talking about the directly continuous hereditary families and institutions associated with those things that are tied to processes that go back to ancient Rome and empires before that. So there's a direct continuity of certain inbred families, a limited amount of them, quite a few, but a limited amount, that are also propagating certain hereditary properties, trusts, fondi, possessions that maintain a continuity, but also are associated with a variety of occult rituals or an inner sort of religious doctrine for the so-called inner elite that promulgates the belief structures of that oligarchist culture, which is very unnatural. It's not easy to maintain something that perverse. So it's a complex thing in a sense. But that's when I say oligarchy, that's what I mean.
Yeah, in the first episode of your series, you kind of go through that whole line and sort of bring it from the past thousands of years ago, or who knows how long before that some of the stuff was around there. And you sort of bring it forward into today, where we now see that same line is, you could probably draw it right through the evolution narrative and right today into the UFO narrative that you break down in your series.
Yeah, you really can. And I mean, it's not, at the end of the day, the purpose of Darwin, at the end of the day, when you look at why did Huxley want Darwin to be the dominant thing, the dominant explanation of life, it wasn't just because they really care about biology. It's really that there was a whole new concept of the nature of what it means to be a human being that was being enforced, which had political effects. And part of it was the idea to replace the outdated, troublesome concept of human nature that people mostly had believed in, as enshrined in the book of Genesis. The idea that we're made in the image of a living, reasonable creator, that we could participate in the process of creation as a species, that means that life is sacred. These are not concepts to be taken lightly, these ideas of what human beings are as a noble, divine species with attributes that make us stewards of nature, not simply another species trapped by the same cycles that define and bound non-human forms of biospheric life, but that we have an edge, something above it. These are all things that were very troublesome to oligarchical systems of control. They made us unwieldy. For those who wanted to take those thoughts seriously and act upon them, it made things very difficult. Let's just say that, and it made us a bit of a headache. So by reducing us to just another form, as Darwin's second, or I think his second major book, Descent of Man, made the point that by reducing us to something that is like a direct continuous flow from apes, it kind of fudged out the sacredness thing, and it by reducing everything to a struggle for survival in a world of diminishing returns, as Darwin himself noted that his discovery or his insights, his model emerged out of his reading of Thomas Malthus, which he wrote in his autobiography when he was saying, I was on the Beagle and looking for a theory by which to work. I couldn't figure it out, and I read Thomas Malthus's essay on population. Malthus, by the way, being the British East India Company economist who found a mathematical model for population control, and on behalf of his bosses at the British East India Company, he was a teacher at the British East India Company's Haileybury College. So he wasn't just a philosopher just philosophizing what causes overpopulation. He had a political agenda. And he came up with a mathematical model, and he advocated the killing off of the excess useless eaters, the babies that are born that the state cannot support, that they could be eliminated. And he prescribed different very cold-hearted remedies utilizing famines, plague, starvation, war. He actually said, these are gifts that God has given us to manage the excess population in the first edition of his essays on population. So this is the type of character that Darwin is reading and saying, aha, now I was given a theory by which to work by appreciating the struggle for diminishing returns in a world of scarcity. And that creates a tension out of which the idea of a randomized mutation function that he just presumed existed. He didn't even know about genetics, but he's like, he presumed that there was some like random function of mutations that would generate certain macro attributes biologically, bigger claw, faster sprint or whatever, bigger peacock feathers, to allow members of whatever species to kill off the weaker, or get more sex, get more food, and the weaker that couldn't get as lucky on the dice rolls of the genetic mutations would just lose out and would disappear, and they would go extinct. So that the idea was always to extend that to human population. So once that could be adopted in the sort of safe scientific domain of explaining away biological systems, the idea was immediately already to then extend it back, as Malthus had already done, to manage global systems of humans with things like eugenics, advanced by Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, a very close associate of Thomas Huxley and the X Club, as well as Herbert Spencer, who had a different variation of the same thing, but one had a more centralized control system of the eugenics. So that was like, Galton was, okay, if this is a science, let's have a centralized agency to control the science of human breeding, right? And it was always Malthusian, right? And
I would think there's a tie in there between, pushing eugenics, something that would be very unpalatable, I think, if you do see life as sacred, if you do see life as having some meaning behind it. But if you're in the paradigm of, well, we're all just random chance and, a bunch of molecules bounced here and there and then monkeys and here we are, maybe it's not, not as distasteful, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's what is a big deal if if you kill, I mean, if we're just made up of dead molecules, and my book is made up of dead molecules, and there's carbon in my book and carbon in my body and carbon in my microphone, what's the difference between like burning my book and smashing my microphone, and killing my neighbor with a hammer? It's all just molecules breaking. I mean, what's the moral difference? You know, so you start just blurring the lines. Of course, Darwin even says only the stupidest in his descent, the descent of man. He even has a little line where he's like, you know, every species, the weakest of all species die off, and only human beings are so stupid that we allow the weakest of our race to procreate. And he even says something even darker, like to not be eliminated or something like that. But then he says another paragraph later as a disclaimer, he's like, but of course we wouldn't do what other species do by killing them, because we have ethics. And so I think that Darwin he's just an inconsistent guy in my assessment. I don't think he's as self-aware of what he's a part of as, let's say, a Huxley was, who he wouldn't even be trusted. They wouldn't trust Darwin to go out and argue his case in public debates. That's why Thomas Huxley existed, because he could actually eviscerate enemies, even though Huxley admitted in his letters to his allies that he didn't even believe in Darwinism. He was an agnostic, but he also didn't believe in Darwin's theory, because he was actually looking at all of the literature and noting that there was directionality. There were, you know, these things. But so why was he doing? Why did he put so much of an effort into advancing and protecting the Darwinian system? It's because he was loyal to a different type of religion, but it was a religion based upon a system of empire, the maintenance of systems of control, a religion of stasis, master-slave relationships where the slaves would be allowed a certain perception of the world, a certain access of a very limited spectrum of their emotional and mental state. And the elites would have a wider spectrum of they would have their own culture. They would be distinct from the masses, the culture of the slaves. And, you know, so Huxley and his ilk advanced this thing, and they were working with Galton and Spencer and others to create, as Galton later on said, a new religious order based upon eugenics. And Galton gave a speech in 1904, and he gave actually several speeches and wrote about this. And he says, I don't see any reason why eugenics should not be the foundation of a new global world religion. And all of that's at the heart of what has been motivating, I think, the oligarchy over centuries and centuries, is the idea of establishing a new system of spiritual self-controls for the masses that look a lot more like pre-Christian paganism, in terms of if you investigate the type of mystery cults that dominated the world, the Roman Empire, the Persian, the Phrygian Empire, the Babylonian empires. It was always a global system of top-down mystery cults shaped by an initiated priest class that had degrees, both a diffuse degree of initiatory experiences for the masses, in a very hedonistic sort of set of rituals based on a lot of sex, a lot of orgies, a lot of things that involve Dionysiac sort of frenzies. That would keep people in a state of thinking that that's how they're accessing the feeling of the gods. And then degrees that are a little less diffused for the initiated higher class of managers and the managerial elite that were allowed to go a little bit higher, but ultimately were still degenerate in their own way. And the people were kept, at war with each other, at war with ourselves in a sense, incapable of changing anything about our world that we deem to be unjust, or even thinking about what injustice means. So that was a system that I think has been romanticized by a lot of the oligarchs, that they've been trying to revive in some way, both by infiltration of Christian and Muslim and Jewish and other faiths around the world. So they work at corrupting things from within, but also destroying them from the outside at the same time. And that's a big part of the 20th century, since eugenics was really brought online as the new religion.
Well, and perhaps that conversation about the new religion is what can sort of lead us into this conversation about UFOs, because there's no doubt that the push for a new religion of sorts is very much tied into the disclosure of UFOs, the conversation about UFOs. And a lot of your work, I mean, some of it, I got to be honest, kind of burst my bubble a little bit because, I grew up such a big fan of Star Wars, of George Lucas, of Spielberg, of all that stuff. And then later got into the X-Files and, thought, of course, like, fuck, I love Fox Mulder because he's the rebel. He's the one trying to disclose what the government's hiding. And at some point you start to actually sort of not actually believe it in real life. You still see it as fantasy, but you wed yourself to that narrative so much that when you finally start to peek behind the curtain and you realize, wait a minute, I thought that because I got that from Time Magazine, I got that from the Fox News Corporation. You realize all the sources are the same sources as everything else. So maybe you can tie in how this cultural push, this push that's been going on really for decades to normalize UFOs, aliens, you could almost say as sort of a friendly feature of the universe, how that ties into this push for a new religion.
Mm. Well, I guess a jump off point on that would be H.G. Wells. I think he's an important one. He was a student, actually. Herbert George Wells, student of Thomas Huxley at the Normal School of Science in London. No, not London, some other town but Britain. Now, Huxley was under the patronage of Huxley. Wells was noted for a talent, a sort of creative flexibility and a genius. He wasn't born from a highbrow family. He was, his parents were gardener. One was a gardener, one was a servant. He had a bit of a chip on his shoulder, but Thomas Huxley was also not born from a high family. Both of them noted the systemic fallacy or Achilles heel of the empire system that they devoted their lives to maintaining as high priests of that empire, which was the complacency and decadence of the hereditary class of nobles, the so-called black nobility, as some call it. But there's a sort of a lack of creative flexibility due to a sense of feeling of entitlement, of privilege, and security in systems of political economic controls. And they wrote about it, especially H.G. Wells wrote about it quite a bit in his Anticipations, his autobiography in 1901. And they basically noted that, look, if you want to survive, you have to be, as an empire, more capable of introducing new talent into the machinery. You can't just be so rigid with the glass wall of separating you from the lower classes. Basically saying, give us a job, we'll do good for you, boss. Come on,
I can be a good elite helper guy. Come on.
Yeah, treat me good, I'll treat you good. These
want me to write some stories for you? I mean, whatever you need.
Yeah. And so part of this idea was, as Wells noted, predictive programming, the utilization of a form of warfare that hadn't been really exploited before this moment of the 1890s in the form of science fiction. So Wells comes out running. He's working for W.T. Stead, who is a patron and collaborator of Cecil Rhodes, running the Pall Mall Gazette. Also a big guy who's also sponsoring Annie Besant, who goes on to head the Theosophist movement, other forms of occultic operations that are all integrated with the Fabian Society. Annie Besant becomes a leading member of the Fabian Society as well as a leader of the Theosophist movement. Not a coincidence. So H.G. Wells, after working for the Pall Mall Gazette, starts publishing these highly promoted books like the Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Invisible Man. And he's highly productive, very creative guy, and he's incorporating a lot of cutting edge science because he also gets briefings from the X Club grouping of scientists around Huxley. They're all very integrated. So they're able to take sort of cutting edge science, but with a very cynical view of human nature in the future to create dystopic outcomes of science being applied always for destructive purposes by stupid people. So human nature is always the dumbest thing ever in H.G. Wells' stories. We are our own worst enemy, which is part of the oligarchical disdain for humans. They always want to convey the idea that we are something, you
give us any toy, we're going to just destroy the whole house.
Can't trust us with anything. Yeah. Unless, and in a lot of Wells' stories, the savior that restores order is oftentimes a world government force of scientific masons like you have in The World Set Free or...
sometimes an alien.
or sometimes an alien, which gets us to take ourselves more seriously. But even there, we end up becoming still foolish by the end when the aliens die of like some germ.
Right.
So it wasn't even our own ingenuity that fought the aliens properly, you know. But the use of the idea of flying saucers that, as far as I could tell, were first innovated by him as a threat of a foreign entity that would unite us all, was adopted by other Fabians like John Dewey, the educational reformer in America, who was a leader of the American branch of the Fabian Society, wrote for the New Republic with Walter Lippmann and others. He was also giving speeches to the Japanese delegation during World War I, saying that we need to only the idea of an invasion from Mars would get human beings to behave appropriately. All of them were against the nation state. All of these Fabians were for what's called social imperialism, which gave rise to, National Socialism in Germany, the different socialisms in Italy that gave rise to Mussolini. He was a socialist. So people don't know what this means. It's specifically Fabian socialism was the Lloyd George, Roundtable, Milner. They all called themselves imperial socialists. That's what it was. It was a system of basically global one world government empire, with fascist managers who would maintain state controls over our lives in different jurisdictions of the world. But the problem was people still believed in liberty, democracy, sacredness of life. These were all the family. These were all things that made us resistant cognitively to these types of remedies for all of our problems, like world government, and reset human civilization's nature. So H.G. Wells wrote extensively about the need to create a new religion in his Open Conspiracy, in his New World Order, The World Set Free. He writes a lot of stuff, and he's very active. He's a co-author of some of the core legislation that created the League of Nations as a first attempt at a one world government. And his War of the Worlds was broadcast in New York for the first time as a social engineering experiment funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in 1938, just to see how people would react with the idea now of like a broadcast from Orson Welles, no relation.
Just a fun thing to do when you have money, right?
Yeah. No, World War II is just beginning, and people are just listening to the news, and all of a sudden the news is telling them that Martians are killing millions of American citizens. They don't know what to take of this. So it's a psychological experiment to see, and there's several other similar things done in Brazil and South America by the Rockefeller Foundation, always overseen by key figures from the American Roundtable Group. That's the Cecil Rhodes Milner Group in America under the Council on Foreign Relations. Hadley Cantrell, the guy who becomes the founder and controller of the Rand Corporation, whose name Robert. It'll come later. Robert Stanton. These two, Cantrell and Stanton, are overseeing the Princeton Radio Research Project that is running this War of the Worlds broadcast. Both of them, again, Stanton becomes the head of Rand Corp. Rand Corp becomes one of the conduits that manages the Cold War, that oversees basically the undermining of the national institutions of America and other parts of the world for this new technotronic elite, as Zbigniew Brzezinski later on called it. So the story of the UFOs becomes a big part of the Cold War. Obviously, people are seeing something after World War II is over. There's a lot of sites of unidentified flying objects. That's definitely happening. But of course, people are not being told so much about Project Paperclip, the Nazi and Italian aerospace engineers working on flying saucer tech. That was part of the aerospace projects of that were never finalized completely, but they came really close. And those engineers and aerospace engineers were all absorbed by the U.S. military-industrial complex, labeled under classified. And a lot of the scientific controls were, by this point, really shaped by the Manhattan Project, which made secret science under the control of intelligence agencies in the military-industrial complex. It really made this thing vicious. So it created a veneer of that veneer of secrecy that the Cold War demanded, created obviously a mystique in the zeitgeist, the public psyche, that had to be then fed with narratives that would explain to people what they were seeing. And so you just have this giant burst of all sorts of propaganda in film and cinema and books, but also in the mainstream media as well. Henry Luce, I don't know how to pronounce his name, who ran Time Magazine, the big fascist, who worked with Henry Kissinger and the Rockefellers. He was also publicizing, starting in the late 40s, material about why aliens are real and why there must be, and using people from the Air Force who are coming on speaking as if they were all of a sudden given the green light to just speak about these foreign entities that seem to be interfacing with humans and governments.
Sounds oddly familiar to today.
Yeah, nothing that we're being shown today is at all original. It's just a recap, a rehashing of the same techniques. And people were, I mean, we were just attacked on every single level, spiritual, psychological, you name it, during that whole Cold War period. The murder of JFK, the unnecessary wars, the regime. The U.S. ran something like 230 regime change operations that killed millions of people. Many leading, beautiful souls who were taking political responsibility in different countries were killed by the CIA. And Americans were so confused, distraught, fearful that and filled with propaganda on every level that they took it. They kind of went with it, even when their own leaders were being killed by this entity. And I'm not talking about aliens. I'm talking about this entity that H.G. Wells put into motion. And yeah, I mean, in the documentary series, we're going to be we just set the tone by going back into some deep history regarding we want to just look at some of the mystery religions and the cults of the past, how they worked geopolitically to manage wars, political intelligence, and other things. How that rebranded itself after Christianity emerged onto the scene in a new garb, but maintained the same type of systems of control and manipulation into the age of spiritual, like false spiritual synthetic cults created in the 18th, 19th centuries. And that's going to set the tone for the next 7 or 8 videos that are going to be part of the series that are going to tackle H.G. Wells, a lot of the dynamics of the Stanford Research Institute, the role of a lot of the key players even today who are promoting alien disclosure. What are they genuine, or is there something darker behind them? We're going to address all of that. So, yeah.
And you've made the connections too between not just the government propaganda that we see, but also the propaganda in film. Can you dig into a bit of specifically, talking about like Spielberg, E.T., the connections between those films that my naive young self just wanted to think, man, this brilliant guy just came up with this awesome idea about a cute little alien. But where does this stuff actually come from?
Oh, that's a big one. But I know we're limited for time. But I guess I'll just say it in a summary.
Just give us a teaser, and we'll people will tune into your work for more. Yeah.
Well, I guess Lucas and Spielberg were two guys who had a very big role to play. They were probably two of the most influential filmmakers of all time in terms of shaping the zeitgeist, the idea of what humanity is, what the future is, what aliens are, like a lot of the things that we take for granted. They created a space in the collective mind of what is possible and what is probably even real is embedded in the what's set up in things like Star Wars, in things like E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, hugely influential movies. It's important to take note of people like Joseph Campbell in this process. Campbell being the hero with 1,000 faces. He was a very important person who worked with the Stanford Research Institute's project for remaking the Images of Man program in the 1970s. That worked very closely with the Stargate project as well. This is where people like Hal Puthoff.
Not Stargate the movie, by the way. The actual Stargate project which is a thing.
That's a thing, yeah. It was the Stanford Research Institute's remote viewing project that interfaced with the military-industrial complex and MK Ultra from the CIA and utilized a lot of psychedelic drugs that had been refined under the MK Ultra program. This is where all this stuff comes from. It doesn't come from like benevolent, spiritualists that just want us to get better access to our inner powers and God or something, or gods. It all comes from the military-industrial complex that was looking at carrying out the mandate of MK Ultra, which was how do we depattern human society as a whole using different aspects of drugs, trauma, shock, neurolinguistic programming emerged out of that as one of the aspects of the multifaceted so-called solution, such that a depatterned population could then be reconstructed, repatterned around a new system of programming more conducive to being a happy slave class. And as Aldous Huxley described to Timothy Leary in Timothy Leary's autobiography, a new scientific paganism would replace the Judeo-Christian values, which was always the drive behind the followers of Huxley, Aldous Huxley being the grandson of Thomas Huxley, carrying out the same family religion, generations later. So the devoted disciples of Aldous Huxley, who wanted to be the alphas in his Brave New World. That's not a warning or just a fanciful trip. It was just like H.G. Wells' predictive programming and a bit of a open conspiracy guide to navigate through the management of the transition from a nationalist world of Judeo-Christian values to a new type of world of test tube babies and happy, narcissistic hedonists that would be more conducive to being human animals under a zoo. And those disciples were involved, were the founders of the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. This was the sort of the incubator for a lot of the counterculture social engineering project. It was the incubator for the Stanford Research Institute when it was set up as far as the remote viewing project that was part of the military-industrial revolution that was being planned by people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel P. Huntington, was to create these super soldier, Jedi-like superhuman knights with a very romantic self-importance in their psyche that gave them a sense that they have superhuman powers, but that had to be justified by the veneer of some form of science, which was why the quantum, the new breed of quantum physicists, who weren't really physicists, they were more mathematical probability theorists, became very useful because with mathematical probability theory, unlike the old, obsolete, outdated science of like Max Planck and Madame Curie and Mendeleev, who actually made discoveries, those were physicists. Unlike that, but those now we know that those are obsolete, old, obscure thinkers who were not able to transition to the new age where truth no longer exists, because quantum mechanics somehow proved that there was no truth because you couldn't measure a photon's position and velocity.
Therefore,
so
multiverse.
That's where the multiverse is a direct consequence of imposing probability theory as the new god, the god of chaos and randomness onto physics. And as soon as that was done, which really came out with the Manhattan Project, that was like all of the old school scientists who discovered the quantum world and discovered the atom they were all iced out. And only the new breed of followers of Heisenberg and Niels Bohr were allowed in, like Oppenheimer, or Norbert Wiener or von Neumann, or a lot of these creatures who didn't believe in truth as an article of faith. They only believed in the science of maybe, of dice rolling, just like the Darwinians, who only believe in the science of like maybe, of rolling of the dice on genetic mutations. Same thing for these guys. And they became the basis for the new standard models of the atom, of cosmology, of Big Bang cosmology. All of this stuff was all enshrined. And as soon as we allowed this to be the only permitted lexicon around which we were allowed to navigate our understanding of the universe, well, all of a sudden it's like, how did you account for the Big Bang? If you presume that the Big Bang existed because that's how you're reading the redshift, well, if that's the case, then you can extrapolate that to 13.7 billion years ago at some moment where everything was like this infinite point mass. Where did that point mass come from? Because something can't come from nothing. Well, then either you allow for the absurdity that something just came from nothing, or you have to then say, well, maybe there are these other multiple universes around which this vibrating string was bouncing in and out of, and they just crossed it. Luckily, our one universe that then released all of the energy that currently exists, all at that one point mass, 13.7 billion years ago. And so the idea of multiple universes was like a fudging, an attempt to create a solution to a non-existent problem, because there were other ways of solving the problem of redshift than simply assuming it was all like a point mass. But regardless, by then introducing a whole set of assumed dimensions that are outside of the purview of human reason, thought, or analysis. You can't really do any tests to prove or disprove any of these theories. Everything just became you could have a model with 11, with 28, with 39, with 9,000 dimensions, with infinite dimensions. It doesn't matter as long as the mathematics is internally consistent. And it can always be internally consistent because, I mean, I could turn into a purple hippopotamus, grow wings, and fly out my window through my wall by vibrating my particles and having the power of intention. And you can't say, if you're a probability theorist, that on some scale that's not possible, though unlikely. So anything becomes possible. And thus you could justify why these, like at the Stargate project at the Stanford Research Institute, why super soldiers who are on psychotropic drugs and transcendental meditation, all being funded by the Lawrence Rockefeller, by the way, and the Rockefeller machinery, can't just like align their particles to run through walls and kill goats by blowing up their hearts with the power of intention and all this other stuff. That becomes embedded in the reforms in the military itself, especially in the early 80s. So I'm getting at this in the roundabout way because I didn't forget your question on Spielberg and Joseph Campbell. So Joseph Campbell worked on the Stanford Research Institute and Warren Harmon's program for remaking on remaking the images of man, and made a point that we need new sacred stories that take and extract the universal archetypes of the various stories of the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Christian stories, everything. Look for what's universal, including in Native Hopi Indian stories, other things. Look for what's universal, and we need to extract whatever is universal from different religions and use that as the material around which to remake new sacred stories that would provide those big answers to the big meta questions regarding why is human, other things. And George Lucas, and again, Joseph Campbell's career was largely sponsored by Lawrence Rockefeller, the guy who was also overseeing the funding of the War of the Worlds broadcast and the conversion of the USA into an
busy
empire.
Busy guys.
Busy, really incredibly, almost impressive. Also the same guy who ends up founding the Disclosure Project, recruiting one of his Tavistokian transcendentalist meditation followers, Stephen Greer, to become the spokesman for his Disclosure Project, is Lawrence Rockefeller. So all that to say, Joseph Campbell his career is bought and paid for in large measure by the Lawrence Rockefeller directly. He becomes a guru in many ways to Lucas describes Campbell's work as being his guiding light in shaping the storyline, the structure of the world of Star Wars, which in my view, in analysis, knowing what I know now, I think is a lot in common with L. Ron Hubbard's cosmology in his sacred stories that became the heart of the first major sci-fi cult, Scientology. A lot in terms of galactic federations, 60, 80 billion years old that are fighting with dark Sith lords and
that galactic federation term comes up everywhere. I mean, everywhere I look. We just watched a documentary the other week about this like mother god cult. It wasn't that much of a cult, actually. It was just a kind of a lady who lost her mind, did too many psychedelics, but she was convinced she was in the Galactic Federation, and it was this whole thing. And I see the same phrase used, and then you go back and you're like, oh, Gene Roddenberry. I mean, it's all from the same sources.
Yeah, no, it's repackaged quite a bit. And I don't know about Gene Roddenberry. Maybe he's authentic or not. I don't know. But definitely there was an idea of creating new sacred stories that could be filled in with detail later on around the concept of, a galaxy far, far away. And the idea of like, they actually brought in the military out of the Stanford Research Institute, which was, again, that project was run by a bunch of Scientologists. It wasn't just Hal Puthoff, who was a 7th degree OT Scientologist, but there was a variety of others. Ingo Swann was a major player in this. Jacques Vallée wasn't a Scientologist, but he was friends with a lot of Satanists like Kenneth Anger and Anton LaVey. Very, very close. And I mean, these guys, he was also a student directly of J. Allen Hynek, the guy who was on basically managing this entire UFO mythos creation since the early days of Project Grudge and Sign and Blue Book. He was always assigned a role in cultivating and grooming this thing, working with people like Carl Jung, who was also working with Alan Dulles on the question of flying saucers as a expression of the collective zeitgeist that could be used for a new religion. Carl Jung even wrote a whole book on flying saucers.
I think that's just the last 2 minutes of all the names you put out there has been just such a good example of the more you start to dig into this stuff, whether you look at it as hidden history or the occult or intelligence agencies, the more you start looking into this stuff, it's all the same names that pop up everywhere. It's the same names that pop up in intelligence. It's the same names that then pop up with occult connections. It's the same names that popped up in the UFO sort of disclosure realm. I mean, it's all the same guys.
Yeah. It's a small club. It's
and very busy. Well, Matt, we'll probably dig into this just a little bit more in the smoke-filled room segment, but we're going to wind down the main show. I want to make sure to let everybody know how they can best find your work in general, and just let people know how they can best find your documentary series here, Hidden Hand of UFOs. It's I've watched the first episode so far, and it's spectacular. It's very well done.
Oh, cool. Thanks. Well, the easiest way to access that first episode will be to go to canadianpatriot.org. It's you'll see it all over the place. Watch our videos. We've done a lot of videos. My wife wrote the script for that first one. The second one's going to be out probably in about a month. You have to wait a while. I'm sorry. The books that I've written, including the newest book that was just released 2 weeks ago, Science Unshackled, and The Untold History of Canada, The Clash of the Two Americas books, those are all available also on CanadianPatriot.org. And RisingTideFoundation.net, we host lectures, study groups online every week. So if people want to get active, we usually ask that they either get a paid upgrade, free stuff, but if you get a paid upgrade, you get all the invites to the live events. And if you can't afford it, because I know the world has kicked a lot of people in the ass, not their fault, the economy is crap. If you still want to read the books or come get involved with or get invites to the events, send me an email at CanadianPatriot1776@tutanota.com. And I'll send you the free PDFs and invites. That's okay.
Well, that's a very kind offer. Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're going to dig a little bit deeper here in the smoke-filled room. In the meantime, keep up the great work.
Thank you.